LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I picked out 25 of the weekend's best clips for what should be a little bit of a shorter show for you tonight. As usual, my clips come from mostly the Sunday morning news analysis shows on the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States. Plus, I'll have several political comedy clips from Friday's Real Time with Bill Maher and one from Weekend Update on last night's Saturday Night Live. You can see the topics I'm covering listed down in the video description, and if you're watching this as a recorded show, you should see time indexes down there to skip to whatever topics most interest you, including two topics that seem to pop up almost every week these days, I guess, Islam and ISIS. And on that second topic, there was another Japanese hostage beheaded by ISIS this week. I've also got one clip on John McCain's reaction to the Code Pink protest of Henry Kissinger as a war criminal, and I've got one clip on Bill Maher's interview of the Edward Snowden documentarian Laura Poitras, where Bill Maher actually says something nice about Glenn Greenwald in that clip. And I've got several clips on the growing U.S. Measles outbreak that's mostly due to anti-vaxxers, I guess they're called, and a couple clips at the end about developments in the Republican field of 2016 presidential contenders. But first, I want to show a few clips on what could be loosely categorized as socialism, though it's also about what's not socialism, and I think Bill Maher didn't quite get socialism correctly defined in his new rule on HBO last Friday night that included the analysis in this clip.
And no one is telling the truth, which is that the large, thriving middle class that America used to have didn't just appear out of the blue. It was created using an economic tool called socialism. Oh, I know. We never use that term here in Buzzword Nation. But that is exactly what our government did after World War II. It taxed the rich up to 90% and massively redistributed that money through the GI Bill so that more than half the population benefited from free college, free job training, cheap mortgages, and much, much more. Yes, for a brief shining moment, we were Finland. Now, we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to go back to, but what is beyond debate is that that is what happened. The 50s and 60s are the era of socialism in America, and that is when a family needed only one breadwinner and a house cost only 2 years' salary. It was when a man could afford college for his kids and dinner at a chop house with the missus, followed by missionary sex in a paneled rec room. On a plastic-covered sofa that wipes clean. Because here's the reality. A middle class is actually not the normal byproduct of capitalism. Ask any historian. A middle class is actually a fluke in history. Like in the 14th century, a middle class was created in Europe when, during the Black Plague, a third of the population died, resulting in a labor shortage and increased bargaining power for workers. So that's one way to create a middle class. But it is kind of hard to see it on a campaign poster.
Now, I actually agree with a lot of what Bill Maher said there about government policies that help grow middle class, like progressive taxation and good free social welfare benefits like housing, education, and even healthcare, though I don't think he mentioned healthcare there. But I think Bill Maher's wrong to claim that any of that is actually socialism, though I hear that argument from Tea Party types. But the actual definition of socialism is government or group ownership of the means of production. So maybe that bailout of the American auto companies in 2009, in which the government temporarily bought a bunch of auto company stock, but even that was pretty weak socialism, though I'm happy to see someone discussing the issue of class, at least, which reminds me, by the way, that my upcoming video will be about class and race and how they figure into the criminal justice system. You can see I put up here, I'll hopefully be releasing that at the end of this week or possibly next with my Patreon patrons getting a sneak peek of a draft to give me feedback. And thanks, by the way, to my first 15 patrons who will be supporting my videos for the first month now that it's February. This will be my first patron-supported month, so I appreciate all of you who have signed up, and there's a link if you want to sign up to support my videos through the 2016 election. But getting back to the issue of progressive taxation and social welfare, I want to show a couple quick clips of Paul Ryan, the chair of the Republican House Ways and Means Committee, who will have a big responsibility in making any deals on taxing and spending that Republicans decide they want to make with President Barack Obama, though I'm not saying that's actually going to happen. But Paul Ryan gave some indication as to where he may find common ground with the president. For example, in his answer to Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press this morning, over here.
We'll find out. Let's get into some specifics. A couple of the tax cuts that the president's proposing for middle-class families include expanding the earned income tax credit. This would be for working families, actually, that don't have kids.
For childless adults.
Childless adults, yes. And then expanding the child care tax credit. What do you think of those?
I think I actually endorse the idea of the EITC reforms.
The first one.
The first one.
Yeah.
I think that that's something that actually pulls people into the workforce. It's one of the more effective welfare reforms that we've had. And so that is something that I think we should work together on and finding common...
In child care?
In child care. Child care or child tax credit? Yeah,
yes.
child care tax credit. That's something we're going to have to look at and see if there's common ground. What I want to make sure is we don't put in place the rest of his agenda, which are all these tax increases he's calling for.
Well, one of the things...
So I guess that sounded like a maybe on the child care tax credit and a yes on expanding the earned income tax credit, which is actually a really good program that began during the Reagan presidency that gives working people making less than the minimum that you need to make in order to pay taxes. Those people actually get a credit that, boosts their tax refund to reward them for working. But when it came to raising taxes on the rich, as you saw there at the end of that clip, Paul Ryan was in full Republican mode, no new taxes mode. And you can see that in the continuation of that clip with Chuck Todd's next question over here.
One of the things you've talked about, the idea of lowering the tax code, but getting rid of some loopholes.
Absolutely.
Some people call them loopholes, other deductions. And so one of the things the president wants to get rid of is this trust fund loophole, the idea that you can pass off some inheritance without
the last time that was
taxes.
done, Democrats in Congress quickly rescinded
All right,
it because
but what do you
it
think
destroyed family farms.
What do you think of it?
I think it's a bad idea
Okay.
because you're actually making it really hard for a family to pass on a family business to the next generation. So what I think the president is trying to do here is to, again, exploit envy economics. This top-down redistribution doesn't work. We've been doing it for 6 years. Look, it may make for good politics. It doesn't make for good economic growth.
We know the full budget comes later this
Now, since Paul Ryan is chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, I assume he's got to know that his argument there was totally bogus. Again, the argument against the trust fund loophole when he says it makes it hard to pass down a family business or a farm because the end to the trust fund loophole that the Obama administration is proposing actually exempts inherited family businesses unless they're sold. And there are these other exemptions in the proposal that means it really only affects inheritances of at least several $100,000. So, as usual, the Republicans are using a bogus argument to misdirect from the rich people they're actually protecting. And so that's actually the last clip I want to show on these more boring but important economic budgetary issues. But the next topic I want to get to that also starts with the clip of BIll Maher is this ongoing discussion of the nature of Islam, and especially if Islamic extremism should be more blamed on the religion of Islam or on extremism. And I'll start off that topic with a few clips on President Obama and especially Michelle Obama's trip attending the funeral of King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, which showed up in Bill Maher's monologue on Friday like this.
Well, President Obama had a busy week overseas. He was in India and gave a speech over there urging them to be more progressive about women's rights. And then he went to Saudi Arabia, where they keep women in beekeeper suits, and didn't say a word. Oh, oil. Is there anything you can't do? Now, he didn't say a word, but Michelle Obama, oh, I love her, man. She went over there, and she did not wear the headscarf, did not cover her head. You go, girl. Yeah, and many Saudi citizens complained about it on Twitter. It was all over their favorite social media site, Cover Your Facebook. And... well, let's be respectful to other cultures, please. In Saudi Arabia, it is considered indecent for a woman to show her uncovered head unless it's separated from her body. Then it's perfectly fine. Well, folks, excuse me, but the new king, he's been there about 3 days. He's already beheaded 4 people. Stability. That's what we look for in Saudi Arabia, continuity and stability.
Now, I'm going to show another political comedy take in a minute on that part about, oh, oil, is there nothing you can't do? But that part at the end about Saudi Arabian stability isn't even really a joke, unfortunately. It's actually very similar to the answer from longtime Saudi apologist and Republican operative James Baker, who answered a question about Saudi Arabia in an interview with Norah O'Donnell on CBS's Face the Nation this morning. And the way he answered was much more respectful of Saudi Arabia than Bill Maher. And I got to agree with Bill Maher on this one, I guess. But you tell me what you think after you see James Baker's answer over here.
In so little time, but I do want to get your take on Saudi Arabia, because you were part of this historic delegation that went to the kingdom to meet the new king, King Salman. So many secretaries of state, former national security advisors there. We now have 1/4 of the planet is Muslim.
Right.
62% of them are under the age of 30.
Right.
What role must Saudi Arabia and this new king play?
Well, you know, Saudi Arabia, the king of Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the 2 holy mosques. They occupy a special role in Islam. Saudi Arabia today happens to be an island of stability. If you look at that part of the world, countries on all sides of them are failed states now. Iraq, Syria, Yemen. Bahrain's got problems. Look at Libya. What we did in Libya was a terrible mistake, and it's now totally. So we're going to be. We need the Saudis. They have been historically a very fine ally of the United States. Are there things they do that we disagree with? You bet your life. But they're a very good ally, and they are going to be critical in dealing with the problem you just pointed out.
Secretary.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I guess Saudi Arabia is going to be critical in dealing with the problem of Islamic extremism, since they were really critical and in some ways still are critical in causing that problem, you know, with their, you know, strain of Sunni Islam, the Wahhabism that is really extreme, and they spread by spending a lot of money, not just, I don't know if it's all so much the government, but a lot of rich people in Saudi Arabia support that. And of course, Saudi Arabia is the source of so many of the hijackers from September 11th, but that doesn't stop them from being a fine ally, I guess, according to James Baker, and I think I'm a little closer to Bill Maher's take on that. But I also said I was going to give you another political comedy take on what Bill Maher said about, oh, oil, is there nothing you can't do, in terms of making President Obama respectful of Saudi Arabia when he went to the funeral, although I don't know. I think you pretty much have to be respectful when you go to a funeral, but I guess Michelle Obama wasn't entirely respectful. But anyway, here's Michael Che on last night's Saturday Night Live giving sort of a different analogy for the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia and how it's based on oil in this clip.
President Obama defended the U.S. President Obama defended the need for the U.S. to maintain a close alliance with Saudi Arabia, despite the country's poor human rights record. But I get what Obama's doing. You see, oil is our drug, and Saudi Arabia is our dealer. And you can't expect to like everything about your drug dealer. Because, I mean, like most drug dealers, Saudi Arabia is a little sketchy, and he has some strange opinions on politics and women. But you listen to him anyway, and you should. Because he's got that loud, sticky, icky oil. It ain't easy to find.
Now, there's definitely something to that about the United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia being kind of like the relationship to a drug dealer, although the United States is much less dependent on that oil. Was never like it was never the United States getting a lot of its oil from Saudi Arabia anyway. It was more European allies. But now the United States is producing all this oil from fracking and these, similar sources where it's becoming energy independent. So that's kind of, I guess, we're beating our addiction to some extent, although in a way that isn't all that great for our environment and for climate change. But I want to show a Fox News clip on the topic of Islam. This is the way Islam and the idea of Islamic extremism and radical Islam, they are really into semantics over on Fox News. And they had on Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte, as I'll show in a clip in just a few minutes. Fox News Sunday, as usual, was like Democrat free for some reason. Even when they had like two-sided arguments, both sides seemed to be Republicans. But here's the Republican senator they had on, Kelly Ayotte, teed up by Chris Wallace on this topic of why won't Obama call radical Islam, and isn't that important? I'll talk about that a little more if you see that clip here.
Back, Senator Ayotte, to the big picture and to that map, and the Obama administration's continued refusal to say that we are in a war with Islamic extremism. Here this week is Secretary of State John Kerry.
Today we are witnessing nothing more than a form of criminal anarchy, a nihilism which illegitimately claims an ideological and religious foundation.
Senator Ayotte, why does it matter what we call our enemies in the region?
It very much matters because you have to define your enemy. And here's the problem. I think they should spend less time on being worried about being politically correct about how we define our enemies and more time on a strategy to defeat them. One of the things we heard consistently this week from the national security experts, including General Keane, was a lack of a strategy it was very disjointed what's happening, and what we see is more outgrowth of these extremist groups in the region.
Well,
Now I'll get to more on that strategy in a minute when I get to the topic of ISIS, but the last clip I want to show on this topic of Islam is President Obama's response to this idea of is he using the right language to describe the Muslim extremists. And this is the one clip I'm going to use from CNN's Fareed Zakaria GPS. They had an interview with President Barack Obama, and you can find a clip or a link down to the entire interview in the video description, but here's President Obama answering that specific charge over here.
Lindsey Graham says that he's bothered by the fact that you won't admit that we're in a religious war. There are others who say that the White House takes pains to avoid using the term Islamic terrorist. So my question to you is, are we in a war with radical Islam?
I think that the way to understand this is there is an element growing out of Muslim communities in certain parts of the world that have perverted the religion, have embraced a nihilistic, violent, almost medieval interpretation of Islam. And they're doing damage in a lot of countries around the world. But it is absolutely true that I reject a notion that somehow that creates a religious war, because the overwhelming majority of Muslims reject that interpretation of Islam. They don't even recognize it as being Islam. And I think that for us to be successful in fighting this scourge, it's very important for us to align ourselves with the 99.9% of Muslims who are looking for the same thing we're looking for: order, peace, prosperity. And so, I don't quibble with labels. I think we all recognize that this is a particular problem that has roots in Muslim communities, and that the Middle East and South Asia are sort of ground zero for us needing to win back hearts and minds, particularly when it comes to young people. But I think we do ourselves a disservice in this fight if we are not taking into account the fact that the overwhelming majority of Muslims reject this ideology.
And I do pretty much agree with what President Obama said there. You know, last week I showed that clip of Howard Dean, who said he wouldn't call Muslim terrorists Muslim; they were just thugs. And I said that was kind of silly, that calling Muslim terrorists or Muslim extremists Muslims, that's not going too far. But I think President Obama has a point that there is a diplomatic reason to try to keep the, Muslim 99% on our side. And I know that there are people who don't think it's 99%, but I guess it depends on how you define it. And that's been an issue that people have discussed. And before I leave this topic and move on to the topic of ISIS, I have been reading along in the comment section. I saw this comment from Rictus Gate said, "It's interesting that President Obama didn't go to France to support the March for Charlie Hebdo and free speech, but he goes to some backwater shithole for some psychopath's funeral. WTF?" And I think that there's definitely merit to that criticism of President Obama. I think that someone from the Obama administration, a high-level person, maybe even Eric Holder, was already in Paris, should have been part of that march, although there are some mitigating circumstances about President Obama's need for security, and also that like March of the Leaders wasn't really part of the real march and was really just a photo op that might have been spun a different way as just a photo op if he had gone, and so I can see some mitigating circumstances there for the president. But I think Rictus Gate especially has a point that it looks bad in comparison to the trip to Saudi Arabia. That's definitely true. So thanks for those. I think I have about 50 people, a little over 50 people at this point watching live, even on Super Bowl Sunday. And I won't really be covering the Super Bowl at all. It's not something that interests me. So I guess those of you who are joining me live probably agree with that. And now, though, I want to move on to the subject of ISIS. There was some nasty news with ISIS about beheading of a Japanese journalist just over the last couple days. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk a little more generally about what the solution to the threat from ISIS and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and the territory they hold. And first, I want to show another clip from Real Time with Bill Maher. This is a discussion with Bill Maher and Mel Brooks. Actually gives some input, and they're basically talking about whether it should be troops or local forces. And then the other person who's in this clip is Joaquin Castro, who's a Democratic representative from Texas, a member of Congress. And then there's this BBC America reporter, Katty K, who's also in this clip that you can see right here.
Well, Obama wants, the authorization to fight ISIS, and I wish the Congress would not give it to him, because I think as long as we are the helicopter parents to the Arab world, they are never going to have this civil war that the Muslim world really needs to have between themselves, between people who want...
I agree.
And...
Bill, I think, the country is still reeling after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the president gets a lot of criticism about, for example, not putting troops or boots on the ground. I think a big part of the reason that the president doesn't put boots on the ground is because the American people don't want to put boots on the ground, and he is responding to that.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Why should we put boots on the ground? They don't like each other. We're in the middle. We are a common target.
Exactly. And that's the problem.
We should just skillfully withdraw.
I mean, if you look at where ISIS is, they are surrounded by people who have pretty big armies and air forces. Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Let them fight this common enemy on their own. I don't know why we have to do everything for everybody.
No, and they need to step up. The Qataris, the Saudis, the Turks need to stop letting people go across the border and stop letting the oil come out from ISIS the other way so that they can make money out of it. And they're not stepping up to they've joined a coalition of the sort of willing.
And yeah, I definitely agree with almost everything everybody said there about letting the regional powers be the ones who fight against the extremists, the regional Sunni powers like Saudi Arabia and They didn't mention United Arab Emirates. I guess they said the Qataris and the Egyptians, obviously. And then in terms of the Shia, you have to. I guess that's why this deal with Iran is so important. If they can turn Iran a little bit more moderate, and I don't know if that would moderate some of the Shia extremism. I mean, I don't even know if that's the goal of that, but I did want to also show the split between the Republican and Democratic Party, or I don't know where Hillary Clinton's going to come down on this, if she's going to be the Democratic nominee. But in terms of using U.S. troops, that seems to be a big split between the parties. Not completely, but most of the people who want to use more troops are Republicans, and most of the people who don't are definitely Democrats. One person who was trying to debut their foreign policy conservatism was Republican governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, who may actually be the front runner according to this recent poll in Iowa. This is like 1 year before the Republican Iowa caucuses. So he was on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. This is the one answer I'm going to show from him, and then I'm going to show this setup they did at the end of the show. When I show a couple clips on the Republican field for 2016, I'll talk a little bit more about Scott Walker's presidential ambitions. But here he is trying to show how tough he is on foreign policy and saying that we need to use troops in the ISIS situation over in this clip.
Talk about some specific, and you talk about leadership, and you talk about big, bold, fresh ideas. What's your big, bold, fresh idea in Syria?
Well, I think I go back to the red line. I think
let's not go back. Let's go forward. What's your big, bold idea in Syria?
I think aggressively we need to take the fight to ISIS and any other radical Islamic terrorist in and around the world, because it's not a matter of when they attempt an attack on American soil, or not if, I should say, it's when. And we need leadership that says clearly, not only amongst the United States, but amongst our allies, that we're willing to take appropriate action. I think it should be surgical.
You don't think 2,000 airstrikes is taking it to ISIS in Syria and Iraq?
I think we need to have an aggressive strategy anywhere around the world. I think it's a mistake.
So what does that mean? I don't know what aggressive strategy means. If we're bombing and we've done 2,000 airstrikes, what does an aggressive strategy mean in foreign policy?
I think anywhere and everywhere we have to go beyond just aggressive airstrikes. We have to look at other surgical methods, and ultimately we have to be prepared to put boots on the ground if that's what it takes. Because I think,
boots on the ground in Syria? U.S. boots on the ground in Syria?
I don't think that's an immediate plan, but I think anywhere in the world...
you wouldn't rule that out?
I wouldn't rule anything out. I think when you have the lives of Americans at stake and our freedom-loving allies anywhere in the world, we have to be prepared to do things that don't allow those measures, those attacks, those abuses to come to our shores.
Well, at least he doesn't want to put U.S. troops on the ground in Syria right away, but you can see he's trying to act tough, and that's because one of the people it seems he's going to be running against is even tougher. This is Senator Lindsey Graham, who Senator John McCain, who I'm going to show on a different topic in just a few minutes. This is Senator John McCain called Senator Lindsey Graham his illegitimate child at one point in the last few weeks, and really pushed him to run for president. And here you can see Lindsey Graham saying, not only do we need boots on the ground in Iraq, but we have to confront Assad. So he wants U.S. troops to be on the ground fighting wars in a couple different places, I guess. And he'll be in the Republican primaries also. And you can see him give that position over in this clip.
And destroyed, and the president has the right goal to degrade and destroy ISIL, but he doesn't have the right strategy. An aerial campaign will not destroy ISIL. You're going to need boots on the ground, not only in Iraq but Syria, and there's got to be some regional force formed with an American component, somewhere around 10,000, I think, American soldiers, to align with the Arab armies in the region and go into Syria and take back territory from ISIL. That's what will make it stop.
The Pentagon admitted just last week that ISIS still holds about 20,000 square miles in Syria and Iraq.
Right.
That's roughly twice the size of Massachusetts. There have been 2,000 airstrikes by American and coalition forces. There were just 34 this weekend. Are these airstrikes effective at all?
They won't destroy ISIL. They do help in some regard. How do you dislodge ISIL from Syria? Iraq, you hope you can get the the Kurds and the Iraqi security forces and the Anbar Sunni tribes to work together to defeat them in western Anbar and take back Mosul. But Syria is very complicated. You're going to need a regional force, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the entire region, putting together an army with American people embedded, special forces, intel folks, forward air controllers to go in on the ground and not only dislodge them from Syria, but hold the territory. And you can't do that until you deal with Assad.
So, as I promised, he not only wants the boots on the ground in Iraq, he wants to deal with Assad. The part about the regional force, that seems to be more bipartisan, and I actually agree with that somewhat. I've talked in the past about even having something like a Congress of Vienna for the Middle East to redraw the lines that were misdrawn at the end of World War I in the Sykes-Picot Accord, and that's really the root of all the problems. But I don't really want to go into all of that at this point. But I do want to show the divide between the parties because that was Norah O'Donnell on CBS's Face the Nation talking to Senator Lindsey Graham, and then she went on and interviewed the Democratic senator from Illinois, Dick Durbin, and he drew a line and said we don't need those boots on the ground. He specifically disagreed with Lindsey Graham, and I'll talk about that a little more if you see that clip here.
Your take also on ISIS this morning and the policy there. Airstrikes, we've had 2,000 of them, and as you heard Secretary Baker say, you can't win a war with airstrikes alone. What is the strategy? What is the strategy?
Two things I want to say. First, the president's on the right track. Bring together an Arab and Muslim coalition that wants to bring stability to the Middle East, and the United States can support it. I disagree with my friend Lindsey Graham about an invasionary force of 10,000 Americans. To plunge them into the chaos and carnage of Syria at this point would be a serious mistake in my view. Let's work to build and support this coalition of indigenous efforts in the region to bring stability. And secondly, this program has been consumed by the issue of terrorism. Remember, the House Republicans have refused to properly fund the Department of Homeland Security, our lead agency in protecting America against terrorism. This week, we'll continue this debate in the Senate. I'm urging Senator McConnell to pass a clean appropriations bill. Let us properly and quickly fund the premier agency to keep America safe.
So I'm kind of interested on that last part. As a political junkie, I'm interested to see how that last part plays out, where the Republicans have set up this showdown with the president over his executive order on immigration by only funding the Department of Homeland Security through, I think it's only like another 3 or 4 weeks. But now the Democrats are going to, flip it back on them and saying, with all, that was before the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks and the rise of, this greater terrorist threat in the last several weeks. And now the Democrats are going to flip it around and try to make the Republicans look soft on terrorism because they're not going to give a clean bill to fund the Department of Homeland Security. So I wanted to show that, and I also wanted to make sure you could see the difference, not just the political angle there, but the difference between the Democratic position and the Republican position. If you think there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to the military, the difference you just saw there is the difference between 10,000 ground combat troops fighting in Iraq and Syria and no ground combat troops. Though I guess there are like, was it 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, somewhere in the 2,000 to 3,000 range of non-combat troops in Iraq at the moment, I think. So that's sort of the general strategy on ISIS. The last, I think it's 5 clips I want to show on the ISIS topic have to do with this more breaking news about what's going on with the beheading of this Japanese journalist, Kenji Goto, and also the military campaign on the ground. I guess the Kurds retook Kobani, and then there was this brief counterattack into Kirkuk, which was covered different ways on CBS's Face the Nation, and then I'm going to show how it was covered on Fox News Sunday. The interesting part is CBS's Face the Nation covered it with the reporter actually in Kirkuk, while the reporter for Fox News Sunday was getting the perspective on the events from Jerusalem, which I think kind of showed in the reporting. First, here's CBS's Face the Nation, Holly Williams, reporting from Kirkuk, both on the beheading and the military ground campaign here.
Iraq this morning.
The video released by ISIS does appear to show the beheading of Kenji Goto, a Japanese journalist captured by the extremists late last year. That's the assessment of the Japanese government. ISIS had offered to release Goto in return for a failed female suicide bomber who's on death row in Jordan. Now, the Jordanian government said it would release the woman, Sajida al-Rishawi, but only in exchange for one of its own citizens, a pilot who crashed in ISIS territory during a bombing raid back in December. In the end, however, there was no prisoner swap. Kenji Goto is dead, and the fate of the Jordanian pilot is unknown. In the Syrian city of Kobani, though, ISIS was finally forced to retreat last week after more than 700 US-led airstrikes and 4 months of brutal street fighting against Kurdish forces. The battle for Kobani was a very public test of whether airstrikes would be effective against the militants. But here in the oil-rich Iraqi city of Kirkuk on Friday, ISIS launched a surprise offensive, killing a local commander and 4 of his men. The extremists were later beaten back, but their confidence in attacking a well-defended place like Kirkuk suggests ISIS is still a very long way from defeat.
Now, saying ISIS is still a very long way from defeat, that's not, being, completely rah-rah for the U.S. military and the U.S. Interests in the region. But compared to what was over on Fox News Sunday, this is Conor Powell, their reporter, like I said, reporting from Jerusalem. When he talks about the attack on Kirkuk, he makes it sound like it's ongoing and that ISIS is actually winning in that offensive. Holly Williams there from CBS's Face the Nation was actually reporting from Kirkuk, which made it seem like it was just this brief skirmish where they had some success, but then they were beaten back, she said. But you don't get that feeling at all from Fox News Sunday, where, of course, they set the whole thing up in the way to criticize the Obama administration in the way most possible, as I'll discuss after you see it over here.
Well, Chris, Kenji Goto's death is just the latest in a long line of challenges facing the United States here in the Middle East. In just about every corner of the region, there is cause from concern from the growing threat from ISIS to Iran to the friction between the United States and one of its closest allies.
2 days ago, there was hope that talks would lead to the release of Japanese journalist Kenji Goto and the Jordanian pilot Muath al-Kasabeh. But Saturday night, ISIS released instead video showing Goto's execution, while vowing more violence. Despite losing the Kurdish city of Kobani after weeks of U.S. airstrikes, ISIS regrouped and launched a major offensive on the oil-rich Iraqi city of Kirkuk, once again proving the fight against the radical group is far from over. And tensions flared once again between Israel and the Iranian-backed terror group Hezbollah, after Israel launched a strike that killed several militants and an Iranian general in Syria. Hezbollah responded, killing 2 Israeli soldiers, nearly igniting another war. In Israel, the fallout from Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision to speak before Congress despite objections from the White House took center stage. Across Israeli media, shock even some at Fox News, which is seen here as pro-Netanyahu would criticize the move.
There is a sense here in Israel and really across the entire Middle East that the U.S. has lost both the ability and the desire to help shape and stabilize the Middle East, Chris, at a time when it needs it the most.
Conor.
So the U.S. has not only lost the ability to shape events in the Middle East, but the desire. The Obama administration doesn't even have the desire to shape events in the Middle East. And I love that part about how somehow the Israeli media got the idea that Fox News is pro-Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't know how could the Israeli media have ever gotten that impression. For those who have watched my LiberalViewer Sunday live clip roundup over the almost 2 years now, I think you can see the Bibi Netanyahu Likud bias in their reporting over many, many months. But I also want to show a couple more clips on this more breaking ISIS news. First, I promised before that I was going to show how Fox News Sunday set this whole thing up as problems that in the Obama administration. You saw it sort of in that last clip. And this is also the introduction to Fox News Sunday that shows that somehow it ended up being another one of those Democrat-free shows, as I'll discuss after you see the introduction. This was the very beginning of Fox News Sunday this morning over in this clip.
I'm Chris Wallace. Islamic extremists continue their march in the Middle East. Does President Obama have a real plan to beat them?
U.S. policymakers refuse to accurately name the movement as radical Islam. We have no comprehensive strategy to stop it or defeat it.
What is the political objective we are out to accomplish? And frankly, I don't know what it is right now.
We'll discuss the situation on the ground and the president's policies with three experts who have first-hand experience. Senator Kelly Ayotte of the Armed Services Committee, retired four-star General Jack Keane, and the chief Mideast negotiator for 4 presidents, Ambassador Dennis Rawls. Then, Common Core education standards expose a split inside the GOP.
This is becoming a top-down approach, just like Obamacare. It's local schools with local school boards and high standards. I don't know how anybody can disagree with that.
2 key players debate the merits of Common Core. Texas Governor Greg Abbott and former Education Secretary Bill Bennett.
I'm not going to show you any clips on that Common Core discussion, although you notice it is one of these two-sided debates on Fox News where both sides somehow turn out to be Republican. Although, like they said, it's because there's a split in the Republican Party, and Fox News is very good at covering splits in the Republican Party because they have really good Republican sources. Not so good at getting Democrats on the program, apparently, because there are only a couple people who might sort of qualify as Democrats, and no one who was like an office holder, no one to like give the other side of the the fair and balanced other side to what the Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte was saying. And Chris Wallace didn't do any good giving the other side. I showed in the Islam discussion how he teed up this question for Senator Kelly Ayotte about how President Obama won't call radical Islam, and he basically did the same thing over on ISIS, asking Senator Kelly Ayotte about the growth of radical Islam, and there's no strategy. Why is there no strategy? And let her go on and on about how there's no trust for the United States and the Middle East anymore, as you can see over in this clip.
Senator Ayotte, I mean, what do we do? I mean, we talk about these coalitions. Yes, we've got Jordanians flying a couple of sorties and things like that. But what do we do when you see that map? It's like there's the fire alarm is ringing.
There is a fire alarm ringing, Chris. And I think what we do is they're expecting American leadership in terms of bringing us together. They have to take the fight there. We help them with the capacity. They have to have the will. But right now, I think many of those in the Arab nations are looking to us that we could work with and saying, can we count on them? Will they stick with their word? And I think that's one of the problems we face. So as we look at an overall strategy, yes, we can't do all the fighting, and they need to step up against radical Islam, no question. But as leaders, we need to bring people together. They need to be able to count on us. And we have to make sure, Chris, all the way.
And you don't think at this point our so-called allies in the region feel they can depend on this president?
Unfortunately, I don't. And I think that there have been many instances. One of the things we took from the testimony in the Armed Services Committee I heard this week was also our word has to matter. And I think there's a real concern out there that not only a lack of a strategy, but in order to be a leader, to bring everyone together, to work together, you have to be able to be counted on. I think that's a real worry.
General.
Yeah, nobody trusts the United States anymore, and it must be President Obama's fault, or at least I guess that's the narrative they're trying to build for the upcoming 2016 elections on Fox News, using the Republican senator they had on without any balance from, say, someone like Senator Dick Durbin, who would give the Democratic side. But speaking of our so-called allies, which Chris Wallace, I love how he used that phrase, our so-called allies, one of our so-called allies is Jordan over in this whole conflict. They had a pilot who was, flying a few sorties is what he said. They actually have a pilot who was downed and who's been imprisoned by ISIS. And I want to show this last bit of breaking news on what's going on with ISIS from CBS's Face the Nation. This is the foreign minister of Jordan. Let me make sure I get his name right by looking at my notes here. Nasser Judeh, or Judeh, Judeh, however you pronounce that. He talked about how they're still trying to make a deal for release of this failed suicide bomber woman who they have in custody in Jordan for this downed Jordanian pilot over in this clip.
Well, there have been demands, certainly demands by our side as well, as you mentioned before, and as I mentioned, for proof of life. We have said publicly that if we do get proof of life, and this is before the tragic cold-blooded murder of the Japanese journalist Kenji, we have said that if there is proof of life and if our pilot is released, we are willing to release this woman. But like I said, so far we have seen no proof of life, which we have been asking for.
So that's all really sad. I hope that works out for the downed Jordanian pilot. And there's been a lot of talk about whether they're negotiating with terrorists. And on last week's show, I said that the Obama administration couldn't really say they never negotiated with terrorists because they made that swap for Bo Bergdahl with the Taliban. But they're claiming the Taliban is insurgency, an Afghan insurgency, and not terrorists. And they make fun of that on Fox News, and I can't totally buy that, although there is a little bit of something to it because in terms of like who would be a prisoner of war, the Taliban was actually the government of Afghanistan at the time the United States invaded, and so they had a lot better claim of being actual lawful combatants and should be treated as prisoners of war, even though a bunch of people who ended up in Guantanamo were from the Taliban and they didn't get treated as prisoners of war. But anyway, I don't want to go any more into that topic. That's the last clip I want to play on ISIS and the recent news about the beheading and then the overall strategy against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and how Democrats are not really wanting to put in the ground troops, or at least the combat ground troops, while the Republicans seem to want at least like 10,000 combat ground troops going into the Middle East again. The next clip I want to show, speaking of people who want to put a lot of troops into the Middle East, this is Senator John McCain. He had this, I guess you call it a kerfuffle maybe, with Code Pink at some hearings this last week. They had 91-year-old former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in to testify, and you'll see John McCain mentions his age multiple times in his answer to Dana Bash on CNN State of the Union. She's the guest host this week since Candy Crowley's not there anymore, and she asked him about this, about him calling the Code Pink protesters low-life scum, and he kind of doubled down on the remark and said they were like threatening Henry Kissinger physically, though if you watch the video in the background, I never really see a physical threat on Henry Kissinger, even when someone holds out some handcuffs, which is when he claims there was a threat. But I don't know, you can tell me what you think down in the comment section. Here's that clip from CNN State of the Union this morning here.
This past week, you had a widely covered moment when you were chairing the Armed Services Committee hearing with Henry Kissinger, where protesters called him a war criminal and worse.
Arrest Henry Kissinger for war crimes!
And you used some language that was also pretty intense.
I have never seen anything as disgraceful and outrageous and despicable as the last demonstration that just took place about, you're going to have to shut up or I'm going to have you arrested. Get out of here, you low-life scum.
Now that we're past that, past the heat of the moment, did you think that was the way you would handle it again?
Dana, these people were physically threatening Henry Kissinger. I'm used to people popping up at these hearings and yelling, and then they're escorted out. That's at least some version of free speech. These people rushed up they were right next to Henry Kissinger, waving handcuffs up. He's a 91-year-old man with a broken shoulder who was willing to come down and testify before Congress to give us the benefit of his many years of wisdom. Of course I was outraged, and I am still outraged. It's one thing to stand up and protest. It's something else to physically threaten an individual, particularly an individual who has served so much to his country, whether you agree or not. As I happen to believe he's one of the great statesmen of my lifetime, or maybe of the whole 20th century.
You called them scum. Is that name-calling, you think?
I think they're terrible people, okay? I think they're terrible people that would do that to a 91-year-old man with a broken shoulder to physically threaten him. No one deserves that, much less Henry Kissinger.
Well, I don't know if Henry Kissinger deserves it more or less than the average person based on his history with the Vietnam War, and I'm not going to go into whether he's a war criminal or not, but I thought that was that Senator John McCain, at least based on the video I could see in the background that they played right when he was talking about how they held out handcuffs and they were threatening him. I didn't really see much of a threat to Henry Kissinger there. Maybe it looked different from in the room, or they didn't play the most threatening video, but you would think they would play the most threatening video, and I just didn't see it. So you can let me know what you think down in the comments section, but I want to move on to the next quick topic. This is another one-clip topic. I couldn't resist showing this clip of Bill Maher's interview. I don't know if I may be mispronouncing her name. You know, I read this book. Oh, wrong side. This book over here, No Place to Hide, Glenn Greenwald's book about his interaction with Edward Snowden. Well, the first person who Edward Snowden contacted before he contacted Glenn Greenwald was this other journalist, and I hope I got her name, Laura Poitras. I think that's how you pronounce her name. And she's part of this documentary Citizen 4 that I haven't seen, but it's coming on HBO in February, or this is February, so it's coming on HBO later this month, so I will be seeing it in the next few weeks. And she was on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher on Friday, and there was a longer interview. I'm just going to show her answer to two questions in a row, both about the documentary. And first, she talks about, or Bill Maher says, I guess he's seen the documentary. He says that one thing that's clear in the documentary is that Edward Snowden is actually sincere, and that's also something that is in the book over there. If you read the book, that's what Glenn Greenwald thinks. And Bill Maher actually says something nice about Glenn Greenwald, so I couldn't resist showing that over in this clip.
Look, people can agree or disagree on Edward Snowden and his place in history and what he's doing and being a leaker and whether those secrets were damaging. I think when you watch this film, you come away, I mean, it would be hard-pressed not to come away with a few conclusions about him. One, he's sincere. He's not doing this for any other reason than he really thinks that this is the right thing to do for his country. And he's quite a charismatic leading man for a movie, isn't he?
He is, actually. I mean, the big surprise for me and Glenn when we got to Hong Kong, we expected to meet somebody in his 60s who was nearing the end of his career and not to meet somebody so young. But I think, in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, here's somebody who grew up with the internet and was really, it was an act of conscience to say, like, the things that are happening, what the government's doing and spying.
But if they make a fiction version, I mean, Channing Tatum, Zac Efron, I mean, I could see that. But, okay, so he's sincere. He's also proved to be right about a lot of this, and the proof of that is that we've had a lot of government hearings about this. And, in fact, they voted on one to really cut back on the NSA's activities. It passed the House, almost passed the Senate, and I say almost, it got 58 votes. It's only in this crazy world we have with the cloture thing that you can lose with 58 votes. So obviously his point wasn't that far off the mark. And I got to say, again, the balls. And also Glenn Greenwald. I mean, I've had my differences with him, but he's got a set on him, too. to do this.
Absolutely.
Because if it goes wrong, and it still could, I mean, you could be, God knows what could happen to you. We know what the United States government is capable of.
Well, yeah, well, we know that they've been going after whistleblowers and sources and journalists. You had Jim Risen from the New York Times who was here. So that's been their playbook, to go after people who expose illegalities. Yeah, there was a lot of courage in the room. For sure, if I was going to be on the front lines, those would be, I'd want to be there with Glenn.
So, yeah, she said something nice about Glenn Greenwald there, and Bill Maher said something nice about Glenn Greenwald, and they talked about the war on whistleblowers, and they talked about James Risen. That's the book right here, Pay Any Price, James Risen. That's his latest book, which I also recently read, where he talks about all the corruption and the people who grab power and grab money through the whole war on terror. And he's also been, I guess he was finally relieved of the possibility of having to go to jail rather than reveal his sources. And so there is a big war on whistleblowers, and it's something that the Obama administration is like one of the worst ever, even though it's a Democratic administration. And I hate to say that, but it's, you can't argue with the facts about how often they've used the Espionage Act, and they talk about it in more detail. I think that may be available on the real-time YouTube channel, which I have a link in the video description. You can see that down there. I want to show, I think it's 4 quick clips on the measles outbreak and how it's due to these anti-vaccination, irrational, anti-science people who, based mainly on this debunked study that there was a link between autism and these vaccines, although people are still finding reasons. And the first clip I want to show is from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Guest host this week, Martha Raddatz, who often fills in, and she then talks about the number, how widespread the disease is in the United States right now, and then turns it over to their medical reporter, I guess, Dr. Richard Besser, who describes sort of this whole situation that I'm talking about with the anti-vaxxers over in this clip.
Of all of this nationally, 84 measles cases reported across 14 states so far, and health officials now have urgent warnings for those who refuse the vaccine. Here's Chief Medical Editor Dr. Richard Besser.
When 3-year-old Uriah Kruger showed up with a telltale rash a few weeks ago, no one was more taken aback than his mother.
When they told us it was measles, it was such a weird kind of old-fashioned thing, like who gets measles? And then he had his vaccination, and so it was a little bit shocking to find out that he still had gotten measles.
In rare cases like Uriah's, the vaccine doesn't work. He made a full recovery, but his story may become more common. A tiny minority of parents has made vaccinations a controversy. Ever since 1998, when a now discredited study claimed autism was tied to vaccines, some parents have opted out of the shots or have chosen to delay them, worried more about vaccine side effects than the diseases they prevent. Dottie Hagmeyer started her children on the normal vaccine schedule, but stopped, worrying that there were just too many shots.
My biggest concern is the amount of vaccines that our children are now subjected to, which are, they get 69 vaccines by the time they're 18 years old. It's double the rate that it was back 30 years ago, and there's been no long-term studies to say whether or not these are actually truly safe for our children.
The most compelling study yet finds no connection between autism and the vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella.
Even though the study linking vaccines and autism was debunked, even called fraudulent, and no other link has ever been established, the anti-vaxxers, as they're sometimes called, still have concerns. But Dr. Stuart Cohen, like many pediatricians, has decided he just won't treat families who don't get their kids vaccinated.
I'm drawing a line in the sand.
Isn't it a parent's right to vaccinate their child or not vaccinate their child?
Would you send your teen out to drive a car without wearing a seatbelt? Would you go out on a boating trip with your family and decide who wants to wear life jackets and who doesn't? That's like playing Russian roulette.
Dr.
So that was a good report, I think, from ABC's Dr. Richard Besser talking about the anti-vaxxer thing, although there are a couple sort of like weird parts to that story. First, the anti-vaxxer they showed wasn't talking about autism, was talking about just too many vaccines, which, I mean, I guess maybe because I come from a medical family, I just seem to think too many vaccines are better than too many diseases. But and then they showed a case of someone who got measles who was vaccinated, which I guess actually is a very unusual case, but it shows how the anti-vaxxers can actually hurt other people. They hurt people who get vaccinated, but for some reason are one of the few who don't gain immunity from the vaccinations. And so because there's no herd immunity, they put those people at risk in addition to their own children. And one interesting thing, I want to compare that to the CBS report. ABC also had on the head of the CDC, Dr. Tom Frieden, but I'm not going to show any clips from ABC. I'm going to show a few from CBS, starting with the introduction from Norah O'Donnell, where I guess in that ABC clip I just showed, they said there were 84 nationwide cases. Here I think they say there are over 100, and then they have Dr. Tom Frieden of the CDC say that they'll probably grow over here.
Is the measles outbreak. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, as of today, there are at least 102 reported cases of measles in 14 states. Dr. Tom Frieden is the head of the CDC. He joins us from Atlanta. Doctor, good to see you. Are the numbers of measles cases going up?
We are likely to see more cases. They're preventable. They're preventable by vaccine, and for places that haven't vaccinated, there's aggressive public health action to identify contacts, to isolate sick people, to quarantine people who've been exposed. But the best way to prevent measles is with vaccination.
So yeah, that wasn't very controversial, but then Norah O'Donnell tries to follow up with a couple questions about the anti-vaxxers, trying to get to whether children or whether their parents should actually be able to opt out, because there are a couple states where they can't really opt out, and the states where they are allowed to opt out are where the outbreaks are, and that's kind of a more difficult question. And you can see the head of the CDC, Dr. Tom Frieden, kind of tries to wiggle out of it and give local control. Well, that'll be the second clip, but here you can see the first attempt by Norah O'Donnell to get the head of the CDC to say that it should be mandatory to get vaccinations over here.
The CDC had declared in the year 2000 that measles had been eliminated, but if you look at the graph, we've got more and more cases being reported, especially in the last several years, and most of those cases are in individuals who have not been vaccinated. And what we see is a growing trend of parents who are get these called personal belief exemptions. Do we need to reconsider those types of exemptions?
Well, the places around the country that really require that personal belief be something that's deeply held and long-standing have a much higher vaccination rate. But overall, we have a 92% vaccination rate in this country. And even among those parents whose kids have not been vaccinated, most of them don't have that deeply held concern. They just may not recognize that measles is still with us, that it's serious, and that not getting your kid vaccinated is not only a risk for your own kid, but puts other vulnerable kids in your community at risk.
But
and that last part is definitely true, not just from what they showed in the ABC clip from the rare kid who doesn't get immunity from the vaccination, but there are kids who are immunocompromised, or even non-kids who are immunocompromised because of various diseases, or having cancer and then getting chemotherapy, or there are various reasons that people can catch diseases even though they've been vaccinated. So you aren't just putting your own kids at risk, there is other risk. And like I said, Norah O'Donnell really tried to get Dr. Tom Frieden from the CDC to come out for mandatory vaccinations, but he really would only go as far as coming out for local control, possibly including mandatory vaccinations in the final clip on this issue I'm going to show over here.
But Doctor, I was fascinated to see some of the numbers, and this is according to the CDC, your own organization. I mean, California, which is now the epicenter of this growing measles outbreak because it started in Disneyland, there last year almost 8% of kindergartners 41,000 children failed to get required immunizations against MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. Look at the state of Oregon. That number is 6.8%. In Pennsylvania, it's nearly 15% of kindergartners. 22,700 kindergartners do not have these vaccinations. What is going on?
We are very concerned by the growing number of people who are susceptible to measles and to the possibility that we could have a large outbreak in this country as a result. Parents are concerned. They want their kids to be safe and healthy. The science is clear. Study after study has shown that there are no serious long-term adverse consequences from measles. Of course, it can hurt your arm. 1 in 6 kids can have a fever 10 days after, but the vaccine is safe and effective. And for those parents who may think that measles is gone, it's still here, and it can be quite serious.
But you look at states like Mississippi and West Virginia. Those two states have mandatory vaccination rules. They do not allow these exemptions, and they have almost 100% vaccination rates. Do we need to think about, in other of these states, making vaccinations absolutely mandatory?
We've worked community by community, and it's a decision for the school board, for the community. Last year, we had a large outbreak in an Amish community. We worked closely with the community. We got vaccination done. We increased use of isolation and quarantine, and the outbreak stopped. We can control it. The future is within our control. If we vaccinate well, if we increase those vaccination rates, we can stop measles just as we stopped it before.
Dr. Tom Fried.
So I don't know if that's convincing. He wouldn't really come out for completely mandatory vaccination, although in some local instances he wanted to allow that, I guess. But he was more for the education. You know, I was reading the comments along the way. By the way, thank you. I'm almost up to 100 live viewers watching, even on Super Bowl Sunday. So thanks for that. One comment I saw over N08549. The problem with anti-vaxxers is that they have not seen their kids or other kids die from childhood diseases. Yeah, one fact that they talked about is there used to be like 500 kids would die every year in the United States from the measles, and it is a deadly disease, and that may be the education, unfortunately, that Dr. Tom Frieden was talking about, how parents have to be educated. That may end up being the best education, or I guess another way to put it is that whether you're pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, the outcome of that debate may be decided by which of those mindsets is more evolutionarily successful by, you know, natural selection. That's kind of a cold way to look at it, but if you are not reasonable enough to understand why to vaccinate your kids, of course, then there's the collateral damage, unfortunately, the vulnerable people who get also harmed by your poor decision making. So I shouldn't be so cavalier about that. But that's the last clip I want to show on the measles epidemic, or outbreak. It's not an epidemic, outbreak in the United States. I want to show a couple quick clips on the Republican field, how it, for the presidential campaign that's already starting for 2016. First, like I said, over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, they had an interview with Governor Scott Walker. I showed a clip from that earlier about his strategy on ISIS. I don't want to show his answers on any of the other topics because I didn't really think they fit into the topics I was talking about. You can see the entire interview by clicking on the This Week with George Stephanopoulos link I have down in the video description. But I thought it was worth watching Jonathan Karl's report on Scott Walker and how he may actually be the front runner over in this clip.
Iowa survey from the Des Moines Register and Bloomberg. Walker is now the top GOP pick among likely caucus goers. He jumped from just 4 percentage points back in October. And in our Facebook Centimeter, look at how his buzz online jumped after that speech in Iowa. Governor Walker is our exclusive live guest after this from ABC's Jonathan Karl.
He's the one who took on the labor unions in a fight that gave birth to the Occupy movement. Now Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker hopes to stand out among a crowded field of 2016 hopefuls.
In America, we value our independence from the government, not our dependence on it.
He got rave reviews at last week's Freedom Summit in Iowa.
That sounded like a presidential campaign speech, or at least the beginning of one.
Well, we've been tested in Wisconsin, there's no doubt about that, and we're looking for good leadership, and we'll see what the future holds.
And has become the newest favorite of the conservative media.
Scott Walker wowed them in Iowa. He is the blueprint for the Republican Party. Scott Walker has shown how to do it.
Walker won 3 elections in just 4 years in Wisconsin, a state that hasn't voted Republican in a presidential election in over 3 decades. Back in 2013, he told me the next Republican nominee should be somebody, well, like Scott Walker.
So describe for me the ideal Republican presidential candidate in 2016.
I think both the presidential and the vice presidential nominee should either be a former or current governor. You can't reform Washington from within.
For this week, Jonathan Karl, ABC News, Washington.
So, I don't know. I think there may be something to the Governor Scott Walker bump or whatever's going on in Iowa that puts him at the top as the front runner. I think that Governor Scott Walker and also Governor John Kasich of Ohio, I'm really bad at pronouncing names, as I saw people were pointing out in the comment section about my, I'm not even going to try to pronounce Laura's last name, who was the documentarian for Edward Snowden, but I appreciate all of your comments down there trying to teach me how to pronounce it. And the last clip I want to show on this whole bump for Scott Walker is this is Mike Huckabee over on CNN State of the Union. I guess he's like not doing the full Ginsburg any one day, but he's like going from show to show every Sunday, it seems, and because he seems like he may be running for president. And Dana Bash over on CNN State of the Union confronts him with the polls of showing Scott Walker as the possible front runner, and you can see Mike Huckabee's reaction and a little bit of actual candor, I guess, from Mike Huckabee at the end of the final clip of the night you can see here.
You're doing okay, but you're not at the top of the heap there. Scott Walker, the governor from Wisconsin, is at the top, 16%. There you see Rand Paul at 15%. You are at 13%, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. Let's just talk about Scott Walker first. What do you think of his mojo?
Well, he's definitely, moving forward. A lot of people are interested in him. He's done a great job in Wisconsin. He's weathered 3 elections. So, sure, he's an incredibly important contender for our party. But, I mean, look at the stable. There are a lot of people. And I just remind people that 8 years ago, when I was starting this, I wasn't even mentioned. I was an asterisk. If I even got mentioned in a poll or in any conversation, it was, oh, and by the way, there's some other people running, including. So it's a little early to take too much into it. Now, quite honestly, if I were at the top of the poll, I'd tell you this is very significant. The fact that I'm not, I'm going to tell you, well, it's not as important as it seems to be. I mean, that's how this game is played. And Dana, you know it as well as anybody in America. But it's an interesting thing to see where Iowa is moving at this point. I'm delighted to be where I am. It's a very tight bunching. It's a long way, a year, as you said, from the caucuses today.
So it's a year from the Iowa caucuses, but it sounds like the election's already started, and I kind of like the way Mike Huckabee at the end there was being candid about he'd spin it whatever way it turned the polls, whatever the polls say, he's got a way to spin it, I guess, and that's pretty true for all the candidates, but that's why I only want to show a couple clips of the Republican candidates this far ahead, and it's the last topic I covered, and I noticed I had about 100 or over 100 of you by the end of the show here, live viewers, and I've been reading your comments along the way. I appreciate that. Like I said, I appreciate the people who signed up on Patreon. This is the first month where I'm going to try to supplement the YouTube ad revenue with Patreon patrons so that I can keep at least like minimum wage for the work I put into these shows and the edited produced videos. As I said, I have this upcoming edited produced video that I've been working on, talking about since last summer, and I have a link down in the video description where you can see the several sources I'm using for clips to make the argument I'm going to make about the criminal justice system. I'm not really going to go any more into the live comments because this Wednesday is also Liberal Viewer First Wednesday Live, where I take whatever questions you want, so you can post those on my Facebook, facebook.com/liberalviewer, or on Twitter, twitter.com/liberalviewer, or on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/liberalviewer, if you have questions you want me to answer for Liberal Viewer First Wednesday. And hopefully I'll have an update on my edited, produced video on the criminal justice system and whether it's racist, classist, or both. And that's, I guess, the end of the show tonight. If you're watching this as a recorded show, you can leave me comments down in the comment section about what you... I guess you can leave them down there for the Liberal Viewer First Wednesday Live. If you actually mark them as wanting to be answered on the show, I guess I can take them down in the comment section here. Keep watching my Sunday Clip Roundup every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific. I appreciate all of you who show up live and keep me company while I show these clips, and I hope you enjoyed the ones I picked out for you. And I guess I'll be seeing you all around the internet.